Pesahim, Dafim Samach Beis through Samach Ches. On Daf Samach Beis, the Gemara brings an anecdote. Rav Simlai came to Rav Yochanan. He said, "Please teach me Sefer Yuchsin." Sefer Yuchsin is a midrash apparently on Divrei Hayamim. Please teach me Sefer Yuchsin. And subsequently he said, "Please teach it to me in 3 months." So he said, that's preposterous. Rav Yochanan said, we can't do that. Even Bruria, a woman Bruria, a great scholar, Dvisu Rav Meir, wife of Rabbi Meir, Brate Rav Chanina ben Tradion, daughter of Rav Chanina ben Tradion, she was such a brilliant scholar. She learned 300 halachas in Klas Meya Shmatza Biyoma, Megimel Meir Avasa, from 300 different teachers. She was such a great student, a great scholar. Even she wasn't able to properly learn Lo Yati de Chavasa B'Tlas Shnin, that she couldn't learn this midrash in 3 years, and you want to do it in 3 months. So that's preposterous. So this Gemara is holding up Bruria as a great scholar. Unusual in the Talmud, a woman is being held up as a great scholar. There are other places in the literature of Chazal where we find Bruria was unusual in this way, a great scholar. This comes up also in the discussion of the permissibility of teaching women Torah. The Gemara has a discussion about whether one is allowed to teach his daughter Torah, and the Rambam rules. The Rambam says, although it's true that a woman can study Torah the way she can do other mitzvahs, like shofar and lulav, she gets schar. But the Rambam says, however, even though she's allowed to do the mitzvah technically, tzivu chachamim, the sages commanded that a person should not teach his daughter Torah. Why? So the Rambam explains, Rov hanashim ein datan mechuvenes leslamed. Most women cannot learn properly, but they distort and twist and misinterpret the Torah to divrei havai lefi aniyas daitan. So in general, women shouldn't be learning Torah, and that's why the Chacham said a person shouldn't teach his daughter Torah. What about Bruria? Bruria studied Torah. So how do we square that with the ruling of the Rambam that a person should not teach his daughter Torah? So the Chidah says, that's what the Rambam means. The Rambam says, in general, women shouldn't be learning Torah. Rov hanashim, most women are not well suited for the study of Talmud, but there are exceptional women who are, and Bruria was one of these exceptional women. And that's how the Rambam understood, that in general you shouldn't, but there are exceptions. And according to the Chidah, according to his understanding of Rambam, a person may teach his daughter Torah if he sees that she's an exceptional woman and she's suited for study like Bruria. Other Achronim disagree. Other Achronim say when Chazal make a rule, when they say Asur, when they say you shouldn't do this, we say Lo Plug. Chazal don't make exceptions, and the person shouldn't teach any woman Torah. Post can discuss. Today we don't do that. Today we have Beis Yaakov. Today we do teach women Torah. Certainly Torah Shabbat. Rambam himself distinguishes to a certain extent between Torah Shabbat and Torah Shabbal Peh. But some Achronim learned that in general we don't make exceptions for exceptional women. So what about Bruria? So another pshat they explain, the Chidah brings this as well, is that there are actually different views in the Talmud about whether a person should teach, whether women should study Torah or not, whether it's a good thing or not. Initially, there were opinions that held that she could, and that's why Bruria did. Bruria, however, according to a tradition recorded by Rashi, Bruria had a very unfortunate end. She had her life ended in disgrace and death and suicide, and that was a result, apparently, of her studying Torah and her scholarship. So we learn from that on the contrary, it's better that women should not learn Torah. The Chidah himself rejects this pshat and says, what do you mean? If the halacha is mutter, we don't change the halacha because of one unfortunate incident. We don't make our own gzeros. Just because someone learned Torah and it didn't work out, that's not a reason to establish the halacha. So the Chidah therefore prefers his pshat that the rule against women learning Torah is not an absolute rule. Women in general, the Rambam says, shouldn't learn Torah, but exceptional women like Bruria may learn Torah. On Daf Samach Gimel, we have a bright, the Talmud brings, Hamiskavein Lomar Truma v'Amar Maser, someone who intended to say this is Truma on some produce, he intended to call it, to give it the status of Truma. Instead he said Maser by mistake, or he meant to say Maser and he said Truma, or he meant to say that I don't want to go into this house, and he said She'eni Nene Lazeh, She'eni Nene Lazeh, Amar Lazeh. So if he said the wrong thing, various cases where he said I don't want to go into this house, and instead he said that house. I don't want to have hana from this thing. Instead he said this person. Instead he said that person. So he didn't wind up saying what he meant to say. The halacha is lo amar klum. his neder is not binding. We're talking about someone who made a neder, or someone who called something truma or maser, which has the status of neder for certain purposes. So if a person didn't wind up saying what he really intended to say, the halacha is lo amar klum. It has no validity. Achiu pivuli boshavin, a major principle in nedarim, you have to have pivuli boshavin. There has to be a correspondence between what's inside your head and what you express verbally. And if there's no correspondence, you said the wrong thing, lo amar klum. It's not valid. It doesn't have any effect. The Rishonim bring, Rabbeinu Tam asked, all of a sudden here in this Gemara, we care what you actually meant. We don't just care about the words you expressed. We care about what was going on in your head. But elsewhere in Kedushin, we have a principle, dvarim shebalev einam dvarim. Person deals in business, other contexts, and he says something, and then he says, no, well, I meant something else. I had a caveat in my head, a condition. I didn't mean exactly what I said. We say, dvarim shebalev einam dvarim. We don't care. The Gemara has a whole discussion about it, but we paskin dvarim shebalev einam dvarim. What a person says is what counts, and what he meant doesn't count. So how come in that sugya we say dvarim shebalev einam dvarim, but here we say that if you don't have pivuli boshavin, if your lave is not shavat to your peh, then what you said in your peh doesn't work. So what's the difference? So Rabbeinu Tam says, if you said the words that you meant to say, but you meant to add a caveat, some kind of condition, some kind of qualification, that's dvarim shebalev einam dvarim. Since the words that came out of your mouth were the words that you meant to say, then it's binding. In a contract, in a neder, various contexts, it's binding. And what you meant to add in your head, or qualify, or limit, or whatever you had in mind in your head, that doesn't count. But if the words you said that came out weren't the words you were thinking, you meant to say truma, and you stumbled and said maser, you meant to say this person, and instead you said that person, you didn't mean to say it at all, that's not binding. In one of the formulations of Rabbeinu Tam, they explain that you're like an onus. You're like a person who was out of your control. You slipped and said the wrong thing. Shogeg, onus, but you're an onus. It's a rule in Nedarim that ha'adam b'shvua prat la'onus. This is relevant for Nedarim, but this could also be relevant for contracts. That when a person says something verbally or writes something, and then he says, well, I meant in my head to explain it a certain way, or to qualify it, or limit it in a certain way, that's normally dvarim shebalev. But in a case where he says, my pen slipped, and I wrote something, and I meant to write something else, according to Rabbeinu Tam, it would seem that might be a valid claim. You'd have to prove it. If it's B'radin L'Chavero, if there's another person involved, and he says, no, you didn't, that's what we meant, obviously there's a question of proof. But putting aside the question of proof, if you said, or you maybe even wrote something that was different from what you were thinking, the wrong words came out, the wrong words came out of your mouth, the wrong words came out of your pen, according to Rabbeinu Tam, that is like our Gemara, that's lo amar klum, because you don't have pivuli boshavin. The primary context is neder and truma, but it may apply to contracts and civil law questions as well. On Daf Samach Daled, the Gemara, the Mishnah describes how they in practice offered the Korban Pesach. They had an elaborate system. So Shachat Yisrael could check the carbon. You don't need a Kohen for that. Kibel HaKohen, a Kohen would catch the blood in a vessel. Nosno L'Chavero, V'Chavero L'Chavero. They had a kind of bucket brigade. They had a chain where they would pass instead of the normal way you do halacha is the Kohen takes the vessel of blood, walks to the mizbeach, and then does what he's supposed to do on the mizbeach, pours it, sprinkles it, and so on. But here it says they would have a whole chain where the Kohanim would stay where they were, and they would pass the vessels full of blood to the next Kohen until it got to the mizbeach, and then they would have a reverse chain where they would be passing back the empties. Each Kohen would be taking the full blood and passing it on to the mizbeach and handing back the empties. They had a line like this. That's how it would work. The Gemara says, why do they do it this way? Why don't they just walk to the mizbeach? Not for efficiency. The Gemara says, Hakamash Malan Barav Am Hadras Melech. Pasuk says, Barav Am Hadras Melech. The glory of the king is with a large crowd. And that's a famous principle in halacha. We want to involve more people. A mitzvah that's done and that involves a lot of people is better. It's a more ideal form of doing the mitzvah than a mitzvah that involves fewer people. Now, the normal application of Rav Hadras Melech, the more common one, is that we do a mitzvah, we do it in a larger crowd. We're going to hear the Megillah. It's better, all else being equal, to hear the Megillah in a large minyan than to hear it in a small minyan. If you're going to have any minyan, a minyan for in shul, it's better to have a larger minyan than to break away. During coronavirus, for various reasons, we have to have small minyanim for safety reasons. Some people may be tempted to continue those minyanim after things get back to normal, but the halacha is, again, all else being equal, the halacha is that a large minyan is preferable because Rav Hadras Melech. So that's the normal idea of Rav Hadras Melech, but our Gemara is saying something else. Our Gemara is saying you have the same number of people. You have the same 10 Kohanim, 100 Kohanim, 1,000 Kohanim, whatever it is, but instead of lots of Kohanim running back and forth, or instead of one Kohen doing the mitzvah repeatedly and everyone else watching, it's better to divide the mitzvah among various Kohanim. The Halachos Of the Daf to the Mizbech, which is part of the Avodah of the Carbon Pesach, carrying the blood, should be done by 10 people instead of one, by 100 people instead of one. Post can bring this in other contexts that we practice halacha l'maisa. The Arzarua, the German Rishonim, say that you should have a different chazan. Ideally, the chazan, the Balkore, the chazan from Muslim should be different. You should have Ruvain should daven Shacharis, Shimon should read the Torah, Levi should daven Musaf. Even though the minyan is the same size, the same 10 people or 100 people, it's better to divide the mitzvah of being the shliach tzibur, among multiple people. Similarly, when you do Hotzah v'Achnasa of the Sefer Torah, take the Torah out, it's better that's why this is what we do today. We have one person take the Torah out and he gives it to the chazan. Why don't we have the chazan just go and open the aron and take out the Torah? So on Yom Tov, if you want to sell them and make money, that's one thing. First of all, it makes money. Second, the post can say that when you sell mitzvahs, that show is covered for the mitzvah. That's fine. But during the week, when you're not out to mechabit people, why do we have someone else open the aron and take out the Torah? The Arzarua says that's because of this Gemara, Rav Hadras Melech, that when a mitzvah is divided among multiple people, that's a form of Rav Hadras Melech, and that's what we see in our Gemara. On Daf Samachay, again, going back to the Mishnah, how they did the Karban Pesach, it says that there were three separate cadres, three groups that offered the Karban. And the third one, the last one, was called Katatzlanis, the lazy one, the sluggards, the laggards, a derogatory term. So the Gemara says, why are we criticizing them? We're using a pejorative term, halosagi delavhachi. You're supposed to have three groups. That's a halacha. You have to have three groups. So someone has to be in the last group, so I'm the one doing it. So I'm doing the right thing. So why am I being criticized? So the Gemara says, even though there have to be three, but each person should try to be zariz. Each person should try to behave with alacrity and be one of the first ones to do the mitzvah. And it gives a mashal, it brings a brisa. Rebbe said, the world needs perfumers and the world needs tanners. Perfumers are full of good smells and tanners are full of foul smells. The world needs both. You have to have tanners. But nevertheless, Ashrei, happy, praiseworthy is he who has the desirable profession of the basam, of the perfumer, and Oilo Mishum Naso Bursi, and woe is to he who has the unpleasant profession of the tanner. Even though it's true, you have to be people in all three groups, each person should try to be among the earlier groups. This raises an interesting question. When you have a mitzvah to do, and there's not enough to go around, you only have one esrog or something, or there's only enough for one person to do the mitzvah. Should a person say, what does it matter? God wants some Jew to do the mitzvah, someone's going to do it, totally my friend, it'll be me. Why should I be the one? Why should I be selfish and grab the mitzvah for myself? Maybe I should let someone else do the mitzvah. Or do we say, no, each person is supposed to say, I want the mitzvah, I need to do it. Who said his blood is redder than mine? I want the mitzvah. So, post can discuss this. There is a Tvu Ashar. Tvu Ashar talks about someone who is being shochet an animal. Now there's a mitzvah of Kisei Adam. He talks about whether he should offer the mitzvah of Kisei Adam to somebody else. So the halacha is normally he shouldn't. However, he says that we do that for Milah. Milah we do, he says. The father lets someone else do the Milah. And he explains that Ma'asim B'chal Yom, even if the father is a competent Moel, knows how to do Milah, he honors somebody else. And he says that even though we find in Poskim, we find the Gemara says, mitzvah bo yosim b'shlucho, normally it's better to do a mitzvah yourself and not to ask somebody else. He says it depends what your frame of mind is, what your motive is. If you're saying, I don't want to do it, you do it, I'm delegating, I have better things to do, you do the mitzvah, I want to go do something else, that's disrespectful to the mitzvah. That is more of a mitzvah to say, I love mitzvahs, I want to do it myself. But if you're honoring somebody else is a great tzaddik, he says, and you want to, the custom is, he says, that we're mahadrin, that we're mahadrin to do the mitzvah, and it's a kibud to somebody else who's happy that you gave it to him. He says that Yafa Nagu, he says, Hanach Lam Yisrael, the minhag is we do honor people, not because we don't value the mitzvah, but we honor other people for doing it, and then he says that is the mitzvah. Others disagree. Chachmas Adam says that no, b'derech kibud, it's not mutter. He says lo shamanu. He says that in general he says, even though there is a discussion in the Talmud whether someone should do a minor avera, we've had this before in Masechah Shabbos, whether someone should do a minor avera to save somebody from a greater avera, that's because the other Aveira is greater. But if they're equal, he says, if they're both the same Aveira, both the same mitzvah, he says that lo shamanu, lo reinu b'shum posik, he says, kol yis, he says a ringing principle, b'chol ha-mitzvahs, and all mitzvahs, each Jewish person is roy for all the mitzvahs. It's democratic, it's egalitarian. If you have a mitzvah, you should do it, and you shouldn't be honoring anybody else. Tamal atzmacha, he says, can you really say to the contrary? He says, if someone has a shofar and a lulav, and someone else is more chashuv, and he's not on the same minyan, he lives somewhere else far away, and if you send it to him before Rosh Hashanah, you won't have it. You can say because he's more chashuv, it's because of his kavod, and he's a great person, you should give it to him, he says, and you should be battle from the mitzvah. Absolutely not. Yishtaka davar, he says, you should do the mitzvah. Rav Asher Weiss, however, argues at length that no, that it makes sense. It makes sense. He says there is such a thing as generosity and unselfishness with regard to mitzvahs as well, that if you have a mitzvah but you want to offer it to somebody else, he says that is a legitimate thing to do. First of all, he says you're not being mevatel a mitzvah yourself. If you don't have the opportunity, then you can't do it. So if you give that thing to somebody else, you're not being mevatel a mitzvah, you just no longer have the wherewithal to do the mitzvah. Furthermore, he says, even without that, if it's a zero-sum game and the mitzvah is being done and your kavanah is tahara, you have pure intention, not because you're lazy or you can't be bothered to do the mitzvah, but it's l'shem shemayim, you want to increase nachas ruach for a Kodesh Baruch Hu, you want to increase kvod shemayim by letting someone who's a greater person do the mitzvah, he says, that's mutter. A person is allowed to do that, he says, because it's a zero-sum game. There's only one mitzvah being done anyway. So at the end of the day, there's not more of a mitzvah or less of a mitzvah. And on the contrary, to honor somebody else, he says, he thinks is legitimate, and that would be a mitzvah. In our Gemara, one could have said the same thing, that the Kohanim who agreed to, that the people who agreed to go last, they're not wrong, they're just saying, I'll honor somebody else to go first. But maybe the Gemara is not talking about where the people they were honoring was greater, maybe they're talking about where they were just being lazy. The Rav Asher says, you have to have kavanah setahara. The Tfuah Shar also says, it has to be l'shem shemayim. The Tfuah Shar's language is, that he says that it depends what your motive is. If it's if you're saying any rotzeh, I don't want to be matriach, I'm lazy, I'm busy, I'll be the last cut, I'll push it off, that's wrong. If you procrastinate, that's wrong. If you're doing it to machabed somebody else, or like Rav Asher says, to marbek kvod shemayim, maybe even in our Gemara, if a Kohen would say, look, I'm going to be in the last cut, I'll take the disgrace of being the lazy one, because I want great people to have the chance to be in the first cut, maybe that would be okay. Gemara doesn't say, but maybe that would be okay. On Daf Samach Vav, the Gemara brings a story regarding the halacha that a Karam Pesach is Docha Shabbos. The halacha is Karam Pesach is brought on Shabbos. The Gemara relates that at the time of Hillel and the Bnei Beseira, the family of Beseira, they were the leaders. They had the Nesius, and they had a question. They weren't sure if Pesach was Docha Shabbos. They said, is there anybody who knows the answer to this question? So they said, yeah, there is somebody. There's Hillel HaBavli, Hillel the Babylonian, who had emigrated from Bavel, made Aliyah, and he was a Talmud of Shnei Gedolei Hadar, Shmai and Avtalion. He knows the halacha. They asked him, do you know the halacha? And he said, yes, and he explained it. As soon as they realized that he knew things they didn't know, that he was a greater Talmud Chacham than they were, Hoshivu Barosh, they appointed him, they abdicated their position, they appointed him as Rosh, the Nasi, they appointed him as the Nasi. And he then taught the whole day. He was Daresh about the halachas of Pesach. And not only that, he began to insult them. He said, how come I came from Bavel and I ascended over you? It's Atzl Shaisa B'chem. You were lazy. You failed to study properly. You could have studied from Shmai of Avtalion. You didn't. And that's why I know more than you. And that's why I ultimately have ascended above you in rank, because I studied properly from Shmai and Avtalion, and you did not. The Gemara Bava Metzia praises Bnei Beseira for their incredible anava. It says there were three great, humble people in the world. Two other examples, one of them is Bnei Beseira. Imagine they were the Nasi and they simply abdicated in favor of someone who they conceded was more qualified. That is a tremendous level of humility. The Gemara actually challenges that. The Gemara says that, well, they saw he was greater, so maybe people would realize that as well. So it wasn't such a great level of humility, but the Gemara initially says it was a great level of humility. The Rivash invokes this in a halachic context. The Rivash in a tshuva establishes the rule. It's brought in the Shulchan Aruch. The Rivash by the Ramah, I think the Rivash brings a rule that when someone is appointed to a position of authority, of preeminence, he doesn't have to give it up, even if someone comes along who might be greater and more deserving. As long as he's basically qualified and his appointment was legitimate, he does not have to forfeit his position in favor of somebody else, even if that person is greater. He says that once you're Zachet, you're entitled to the position. Even though we call it public servant, you serve the public, but in halacha, a person actually has the right, in many cases, to a position, public position, to which he's been appointed, and within the parameters of his appointment, whether temporary or permanent, lifetime, within the parameters of the appointment, he has a right to the position. He doesn't have to relinquish it, even in favor of a more qualified candidate. And he brings a raya from our Gemara. In the Gemara Matzia, we see Bnei Beseira did abdicate in favor of Hillel, but that was considered an extraordinary act of anava. There were three anavim in the world. There were three examples of anava that were unparalleled, and this is one of them. You see that normal people didn't do that. He brings a Yerushalmi. Yerushalmi says that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, that Rabbi Yehuda Rabbeinu HaKadosh, the compiler of the Mishnah, he was a tremendous anav. Kol dvar anava avahu osa. He said he would do everything. He was very good at humility. This he couldn't do. He said what Bnei Beseira, he was a descendant of Hillel. He said what Bnei Beseira did to my ancestor Hillel, that incredible act of self-abnegation, of relinquishing a position in favor of someone you concede to be a greater scholar, I couldn't possibly have done that. That's just such an incredible act of anava. Even I couldn't have done that. So you see, the Rivash says this is extraordinary. This is unusual to abdicate a position in favor of a more qualified person once you are entitled to the position is extraordinary. And normally the Rivash says a person would not do that. Normally a person doesn't have to do that. That's the halacha. He says when a person has a position, it's a tremendous madrega to give it up in favor of a more qualified candidate. But Mikra Adin, you don't have to do that. It's interesting. The Gemara goes on. At the end of the story, we mentioned Hillel began to insult and castigate Bnei Beseira for not studying properly from Shmai Vavtalya, and he was lording it over them. He was saying, the reason I'm on top of you now is because I studied properly and you didn't. The story goes on. Hillel then forgot a certain halacha. And the Gemara says, Kol HaMisyaher, anyone who is arrogant, or anyone who's conceited, if he's a chacham, he will lose his chachma. If he's a navi, he'll lose his nevuah. And the example of a chacham losing his chachma, we learn that from Hillel, that he began to abuse them. He was arrogant, apparently, on some element of arrogance in his conduct. And he said, Shamati v'shachachti. He was forced to say, I forgot. It's remarkable that Hillel is being held up as the example of someone who was misyaher, who was a balgava. Hillel was the archetype of anava. The Gemara back in Shabbos, the Gemara said that la'olam, a person should be anveson kehillel, v'aliyah kapton keshamai. A person should always be an anav like Hillel. The Gemara has the famous story about someone made a bet with his friend that he would get Hillel angry, and he kept on bothering Hillel on Erev Shabbos when he was busy getting ready for Shabbos, and he kept on, and Hillel could have gotten upset and said, I'm the Nasi. He kept asking, he kept calling him Mikan Hillel. Is Hillel here? That wasn't a respectful way to refer to the Nasi. Hillel had every right to say, I'm the Nasi, what are you doing? What are you bothering me? And he didn't. Hillel was a tremendous anav. At the end, the person said bitterly, he gave up, he lost the bet, and he said, you're anava. He said, I hope there are not many people like you. I hope there will not be many like you. Hillel said, why not? So he said, I lost 400 zuz because I underestimated the level of your anava. So Hillel said, it's worth it. It's better that you should lose 400 zuz than people should say that then Hillel should get angry. Even though Hillel was the archetype of tolerance and gentleness and anava, other stories there about the Gerim he accepted, he had patience and tolerance for them. But in this Gemara, Hillel actually behaved, the Gemara says, with a certain element of conceit in his conduct and actually suffered for it by forgetting a halacha. On Daf Samach Zayin, the Gemara says, Ish nidchel Pesach Sheni, ve'ein tzibur nidchel Pesach Sheni. A person who is tamei has to wait, cannot bring the car on Pesach, he waits for Pesach Sheni, but a tzibur who's tamei can bring the Pesach Barishon. That's the din of Tumah B'tzibur. Avdi B'tumah. However, V'chi Avdi B'tzibur B'tumah, when can the tzibur bring the Pesach, even though the tzibur is mostly tamei meis? If the tumah in question is tumah from contact with a deceased person. Avol shar tumas lo avdi. Other kinds of tumas, there's no din of tumah b'tzibur, and even if the whole tzibur or most of the tzibur has those other tumas, they have to wait for Pesach Sheni. This halacha was relevant, or almost relevant, for the last couple of centuries, beginning with Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalisher and down to our generation. There were proposals, there were people who agitated for bringing karbanos bisman hazeh. There were all kinds of halachic objections to bring karbanos, besides practical objections that it might start a war, that they won't let us, but halachic objections, there were numerous objections. One of the key questions, of course, is tumah. We're all tameh. We don't have the paraduma, the ashes of the red cow. So the solution, of course, Rav Kalisher said was tumah hotra b'tzibur. We don't have to have a paraduma. All the tzibur, everyone's tameh today. So don't worry, tumah hotra b'tzibur. But of course, even though that's true, of course, the problem still is other tumos are still a problem. So particularly with women, we have questions of nida that are going to be problems. So a woman can become tahora from nida by going to the mikveh. The problem is that both for men and for women, there's a tumah called zav and ziva. There are other types of secretions that the men and women have, which make them tameh, and for that kind of tumah, they're mechusar kippurim. You need to bring a carbon to become completely tahor. We don't have karbanos, so we're stuck. So for women, this can be a serious problem because we treat women, at least for certain contexts, we treat women as suffix zavus, as a question of zava, in which case she might have a problem. Even for men, it's less of a problem because zav is considered unusual, and a man can be a balkari, but a balkari you can simply go to the mikveh for. So there is a question though. So the ikar proposal to eat karbanos, to bring karbanos, to eat karbanos, Karam Pesach would be for men because men are not zavos. The question is, but a man can be a zav. So it's unclear exactly what ziva is. What for a woman, ziva is essentially blood. It's blood. It's pretty much indistinguishable lahalacha from ordinary menstrual blood. In certain contexts we call it nida. In certain contexts we call it ziva. But for a man, a little bit unclear what it is. There are indications that it's a different kind of substance. It's some kind of byproduct of abnormal biology, but it's not clear exactly what it is. Because ziva wasn't really relevant lahalacha, because it's primarily relevant for kadshim, so the halachas fell into a certain state of disuse. So we don't really know exactly what ziva is. Contemporary poskim have discussed whether a man has to be choshesh, that he's a suffix zav. So there are indications that he do not. That the poskim have talked throughout the generations of a man eating challah. We're mafresh challah, we burn it, because again we have different types of tumah. But in certain contexts it's relevant to know whether he has tumah hayotzi migufo, the tumah that comes from zav or ziva or things like that. And there were poskim who allowed the possibility of a person, a man eating challah without worrying about being a zav. So there were some poskim who said a man shouldn't eat challah, or an adult man who already starts having that kind of biology should not eat challah because of concerns about ziva. But there are other indications from the poskim also that the various poskim discussed going on to the Harabayas or bringing the carbon, and they discussed Tumas Meis, but they didn't seem to be worried about Ziva. There are some poskim they bring from the Steipler that Rav Yaakov Yisrael Kanievsky, that he was actually concerned with going on the Harabayas because of Ziva. It wasn't clear if that was the primary reason or not, but the argument is made that men don't really have to worry about Ziva. Women have to worry more about it because we don't always know whether the blood they see is nid or ziva. I'll call upon him. The halacha is clear, though, that tumas meis is hutra b'tzibur. That only works for Karban Tzibur or for Karban Pesach. So that's why Karban Pesach was always a prime candidate for bringing even Bizman Hazeh. But you do have to, as the Gemara says, that the other tumas are not hutra b'tzibur. Shar tumas lo avdi. So before you bring a carbon, before you go onto the Harabayas, you have to make sure that you don't have those other tumas such as ziva for a man or a woman. On Daf Samaches, the Gemara brings a famous statement of Shmuel. The Gemara implies that it's machlokas, but the Gemara brings Shmuel's statement, Ein bein ha'olam hazeh li'mos Mashiach. There is no difference between this world and the era of Mashiach. Ela shibud malchias bilvad. The Jews suffering under the rule of foreign nations, that's the only difference. But everything else, the laws of nature and the laws of society, even as we'll see, according to some, are the same. That's Shmuel's statement. Rambam seems to paskin like Shmuel. There are different opinions in the Gemara, but the Rambam writes in several places, Amru Chacham Harishonim, the early sages said, Ein bein ha'olam hazeh li'mos Mashiach, Ela shibud malchus bilvad. He brings Shmuel's statement virtually word for word. In various places in his writings, in Halachos Tshuva, in Halachos Malachim, and in the Mamar Tchias HaMesim, he seems to work with this approach of Shmuel, that Mashiach will be a pretty normal time, except for Shibud Malchias, it'll be much the same as it is now. And this, of course, fits with the Rambam's generally rationalistic worldview, as he explains in Mamar Tchias HaMesim, that it's his preference to minimize the level of miracles, the quantity of miracles that occur in the world, in general, while miracles exist, but they're extraordinary and rare, and in general, we try to explain things according to Derech HaTef. There are those who learn the Rambam is not passing like Shmuel. There are those who learn that according to Shmuel, there are those who learn that according to Shmuel, there'll be nothing at all different in the world as it is now. Not just there won't be nisim, there won't be actual overt miracles, there won't even be significant societal changes except for Shibud Malchias. The pasuk Shmuel brings is because it says Kilo Yachtal Evyon Mikaraf Aretz. Shmuel said elsewhere that his source is Hashem said there'll always be paupers. People will always be poor. So Shmuel held to an extreme that even society will be more or less the same the way it is now. There won't be new laws of economics. There won't be a sea change in socioeconomics except for Shibud Malchias. The Rambam himself does not say that. The Rambam himself says that in the time of Mashiach, there'll be tremendous plenty. Kol ha'madanim tzuyim ka'afar. Delicacies will be readily available like dirt. And the Rambam believes that there will be certain societal changes, not actual overt miracles. The Lechem Mishnah argues the Rambam is not passing like Shmuel, but the simple reading of the Rambam is the Rambam passing like Shmuel, that Yemos Mashiach will look pretty much, and the world will look pretty much the way it is now. Rambam goes so far as to write in Halachos Malachim that the famous pasuk in Yeshaya, the famous verse in Isaiah, "V'garze evim keves," that the wolf will lie with the lamb, is a mashal. It refers to peace among nations, but not that wolves and lambs will behave in incredibly different ways from the way they behave today. So the Rambam was criticized, the Rava disagrees, and the Rambam faced a lot of pushback. He wrote the Mamar Tchias HaMesim, his epistle, his essay on Tchias HaMesim, in which he spends a lot of time discussing this point, and he explains that his position is like Shmuel, that there won't be differences between this world and Yemos Mashiach in terms of the laws of nature. Lions will still be lions, wolves will still be wolves. It's a mashal, he says. It's a peace among nations, and so on. The Rambam does concede. People sometimes don't recall this. The Rambam does concede. He says he's not convinced. He says we don't actually know. He says we don't actually know, even though he makes the point we said earlier, the Rambam says his approach is to always minimize the occurrence of nisim, unlike the masses, he says, with the more miracles they can find, the happier they are. The goal of men of reason, he says, is to minimize the nisim and to not introduce them where not strictly necessary. But he says that we're not actually sure. He says we have to wait we have to wait until we see the Meher of Yemeinu, what's actually going to happen before we know for sure what will happen. These are not Pinos HaTorah. These are not fundamentals of faith that we have to know. We must know right now, are these things literal or not? But he goes on and he says it's possible, he says, that in terms of the wolf and the lamb, he says he has a few possibilities. He says either it's a mashal, like he said originally, it means peace among nations, he says, or he says that there'll be so much plenty that why do animals fight and kill? Because resources are scarce, they need food. There'll be so much fat and goods and everything animals need, that animals will be less violent, they'll be calmer and less aggressive. Or he says it could be it's true, it could be it is al pshuto, he says. Could be it is literal, he says. It's a miracle. But if it's a miracle, he says, it's limited to the Harabayas. It's not something that'll happen all over the world, he says. If it's a miracle, again, it's a limited miracle that'll happen on the Harabayas. Later on our daf, the Gemara brings a machlokes, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua, about Simchas Yom Tov. Rabbi Eliezer says that a person, ochel v'shosa, yoshev v'shona, a person should either eat or learn. Rabbi Yeshua says both. You should do some of each. Chalkeu, divide Yom Tov, chetziv la'achila v'shtiya, v'chetziv l'beis HaMidrash. A person should spend half his day eating and drinking, half his day in the Beis HaMidrash. That's how we paskin. Shulchan Aruch, mitzvahs Yom Tov l'chalko. A person should divide Yom Tov. The order is the reverse. Even though he said chetzia for eating and half for Beis Midrash, it doesn't mean you should first spend half your day eating and then go to shul, of course. It means first half of the day in shul, or half the day in shul, half the day in eating and drinking. The Marshal, the post can bring from the Marshal a very pointed comment. He says, so L'Hashem is prayer and study, and Lachem is eating and drinking, he says, but Chazanim, who take a long time davening, he says, because of Nigunim, they spend a long time demonstrating their musical virtuosity, he says, that is neither Chetziv L'Hashem nor Chetziv, neither Chetziv L'Hashem nor Chetziv Lachem, and that should be avoided. The Mishnah Berurah brings this and says that the Chazanim, Yesh Ligar, one should castigate the chazanim who spend more than half the day on davening. Davening shouldn't be that long. Davening should be chetziv l'Hashem in shul half the day, and you should spend the other half of the day eating. The Mishnah Berurah brings, the poskim say, what is the correct way to do this? You get up in the morning, you go to shul and Beis Midrash, you daven, you read the Torah, daven Musaf, then he says you go home. After Musaf you go home and you eat and drink. You eat, then you go back to the Beis Midrash, instead of the Beis Knesset, and you learn until half the day. You have an early-ish Suda apparently today. By the time we get home from shul and have the Suda, it probably already is Chatzos Hayom, but in those days the poskim said they would daven, finish davening, go home, have a Suda, back to shul, and learn until half the day. Then they would go home, I guess, again, and then when it would come to, or around, maybe they daven Mincha Gedola, when it came time for Mincha, then they would daven Mincha, and then they would spend the rest of the day after Mincha until nightfall. They would spend the rest of the day involved in Simchas Yom Tov in order to fulfill the what the Gemara says, or Yeshua says, of Chetziv Lachem. Mishnah Berurah tells you, look in Sif Gimel, however, where the Shulchan Aruch warns you that the Simcha shouldn't be, you should have good food, but the Simcha shouldn't be vulgar, and it shouldn't be coarse and degrading. True Simcha is the Simcha that involves Avodas Hashem, even though there are physical and there are gashmius aspects as well, but true Simcha is one that's elevated, and true Simcha does not involve hololus and vulgar and degrading behavior.